All right. So I'm going to be doing technology as a second creation. I thought this reading was really interesting, and given that 2/3 of our faculty for STS are religious or religion doctorates, I'd imagine they'd ask a lot of questions on this. So I'm going to take a little bit longer for this piece. So technology as a second creation is the second chapter, and Thomas Hughes' book. I don't know what the title of the book is. My bad, but yeah, so he starts off by talking about Goethe's Faust, specifically about what can we draw from that like old and known short story about how society is using technology, or how humanity is using technology, and how that relates to a religious interpretation of our use. So like in the story, he talks about how like Faust like wanted to find like earthly fulfillment, so he like makes the deal with the devil to like, or maybe it's not the devil. I'm not sure. I haven't read it, but to like get all of these. Who?
Just a spirit.
Yeah. So like get all of these earthly achievements. So, but Hughes really picks on the land reclamation scheme as like the defining achievement or technological achievement that caused Faust to almost lose his soul. So with that, you have an idea of Mephistophelian creativity, in that our ability as humans to create and innovate and make new technologies might be, or has a lot of potential to be misused through pride. So it's kind of taking a twist off of this divine spark that we have as creators, as engineers, as inventors, and adding like a grain of caution to it. So the next, I guess, work that he talks about, or the next point that he makes, is specifically looking at technology as kind of a human compensation for the divine fall of man. That our ability to create and our ability to use technology and to use tools is a God-given gift. And we'll talk later when we go through the religion and mythology lectures about how like Genesis chapters 1 and 2 relate to that. But you can see a little bit of that playing here. Hughes specifically mentions at one point that after the fall of man, like Adam and Eve had to labor. They had to like do things like for their own or like on their own. So the whole point of the human race, with our ability to create and our use of technology through a religious lens, that can be viewed as our attempts to regain the Edenic state, and that our technology is able to transform our society to be more akin or reflective of humanity, Adam and Eve, before the fall. So that idea that technology has this religious connotation comes from the fact that throughout medieval era and 15th, 16th century, during that time, there's this idea that mechanical arts had the power to transform nature for our own human benefit, so that we're able to, like I said, achieve that Edenic state. A large proponent of that, I guess, idea or school of thought was John Calvin and a lot of other Protestant thinkers. So that's something that Hughes uses as like historical evidence to back up this idea of technology and its religious implications. The next like piece that he uses, he kind of fast forwards about a century and talks about the United States and early colonists. He specifically mentions kind of the Western school of thought that nature was a wilderness, and that as a society we had kind of like this religious responsibility to transform nature to like better suit ourselves and to better reflect, like I said, the Edenic state. So another thing that Hughes does, which I think one of the sections went into in more detail, was his use of art as evidence. So these were, I'll be going through a few pieces that they could potentially ask about. The first one is the Mystic Mill. It's a picture of medieval monks and this kind of carved into a column somewhere in France, I think. And they're working on this like perpetual mill, or yeah, perpetual motion mill that could like consistently grind grain with an extra expenditure of energy. So that kind of, he uses this to show that the human mindset at this time did elevate mechanical arts to a state that we should pursue this more, that this is maybe a ticket to salvation or a ticket to a transformation of our own human stature now after the fall, and what that means in terms of restoring the Edenic state. The next artwork that he mentions is De Rare de Metallica. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. But I thought that this piece really showed technology and mechanical arts in terms of harnessing nature's power and manipulating nature. You can see over here you have a two-directional hoist, and it's being used to bring ore out of a mine. It's water-driven, so you have this idea of using nature to human advantage to manipulate nature, in a sense. So the next piece kind of speaks more towards the idea of nature as wilderness in need of human transformation. This is an oil painting by Thomas Cole, done in 1835, kind of as a landscape of New England during that time of colonization. And I think that Hughes uses this painting to kind of capture the idea at the time that nature was untamed. You can just see from the colors that he uses, all of this is all very dark. There's storm clouds up here. There's this big haunted tree looking thing over here in the forefront of the painting. And like I said, that just emphasizes the point that during the 19th century, the general consensus was to use technology to transform wilderness or transform nature as it's depicted in this painting. So the next kind of avenue of evidence that Hughes approaches is looking at the views of prominent historical figures. The three main ones that we talked about in our lab discussions were Thomas Jefferson, J.A. Etzler, and Thoreau. So I'll talk about Jefferson first. Jefferson had an idea, cognizant of the fact that society was trending towards using technology to manipulate nature. He had the idea of what he called his pastoral vision. And pretty much what that meant was that technology would be used in harmony with nature. Specifically, he really emphasized the point that ownership of land, good agriculture, and good would perpetuate goodness somehow. Hughes doesn't really elaborate on Jefferson's specific points on that, but it is worth noting that Jefferson was a proponent of using technology, but in the sense that it didn't intrude on what nature already had available. Contrary to that point, you have J.A. Etzler, who functioned as the technological enthusiast, where Etzler spoke a lot about how nature was in need of human transformation, and that technology was the way to do that. So he was a very large proponent of dominion over nature, that because we have this divine spark of creativity and are able to invent these tools and new technologies, we should use that to, in essence, take over nature and manipulate it into what we would think of as, or what he would think of as, a kind of technological utopia. So Etzler, in terms of where he stands with his religious views with respect to technology, would be an overwhelming support of second creation. This idea that technology is the means through which humanity is able to create another paradise, right? So then Hughes says explicitly when he's talking about these historical figures that Etzler spoke for his time, meaning that the general trend of society throughout history and even today is using technology to transform nature and to use it for our own benefit. So then, contrary to that point, he offers kind of the transcendentalist perspective of Thoreau, where Thoreau was all about marveling at the first creation, and marveling at nature, writing Walden Ponds and just really appreciating like beauty and how nature was a part of that and how humanity shouldn't necessarily interfere with that. So Thoreau kind of had the idea of nature not as wilderness, but as beauty and something that should be left untouched by human technology. So then going off that point of how technology and nature fit together, and we have a few more artworks to look at that Hughes uses in his chapter. This is the Lackawanna Valley by George Inness. So as you can see in this picture, you have in the forefront this huge tree which kind of emphasizes or draws the attention to nature, and you have the actual technologies being used, the locomotive and whatever kind of like town that is, as like minute details. They don't intrude, they don't impose their presence in nature. So I think Hughes uses this to show kind of this idea or the possibility of having a harmonious blend between technology and nature. So in the actual chapter, he juxtaposes this specific painting with this next one, Eastview of Lowell, Massachusetts, which was the first textile industry town. This was an engraving done in 1834. And he kind of presented it as an interpretation of what the machine or what technology could look like in the Garden of Eden, or through our modern interpretation, our pursuit of our pursuit of the Edenic state. But then looking at this picture compared to the Lackawanna Valley painting, we have technology playing a much more prominent role. You have like a huge smokestack here. All of this is all heavily urbanized or industrialized landscape, and you only have nature like in the forefront. Like I didn't really notice this the first time when I was reading it, but the only like presence of nature in this painting are like these 3 cattle or dogs over here in the corner, and like some trees and water. So you have like two conflicting ideas, 2 different interpretations of what technology could and should look like in harmony or in disagreement with nature. So the next thinker that he kind of goes through, and the next idea that he really hits on, is Emerson's take on value-laden technology. He talks specifically about if technology, or let me rewind. Emerson starts off by saying that technology is value-laden. He establishes this STS concept, which we all know and we've gone over. But he says that if technology is value-laden, what types of values are we putting into our technology? And like, why does that matter? So going back a few slides when I talked about how Hughes opens up with the story of Faust and this idea of like Mephistophelian creativity and our misuse of technology through pride, Emerson would interpret that approach of technology as a misuse or negative values being imprinted into the technology that we're developing. So what Emerson was a large proponent of was infusing technology with positive human values. In terms of the reading, Hughes doesn't really like go into much detail as to what those positive values are. I think that he opens it or leaves it open for interpretation later on. And then Emerson also talks about how those values, like I talked about on the previous 2 slides in those 2 artworks, can be in harmony with nature or not. And he also mentions logos, which is the word of God, about how that relates into how we're using our technology, what values we're putting in. Are we putting in this positive idea or responsible ethic in terms of using technology as a second creation, or are we misusing technology and deviating farther from that goal? So the last thing that Hughes uses in terms of evidence to cap off his discussion on this topic are mainly ecological concerns, looking more towards the 20th century, and what human use of technology has meant in terms of, 1, reaching the Edenic state, and 2, the misuse of nature. So he talks a lot about mining civilizations, more specifically Butte, Montana, and Pittsburgh. This picture here shows a a mine in Pittsburgh or near Pittsburgh, and it just kind of shows the type of living conditions that these workers had to like work in. And also, the next picture at the bottom is Butte, Montana, where extensive copper mining did kind of deface the landscape, as you can see. So this, right now, they kind of like popularized it for like tourism's sake, and that right now, this copper mine is dysfunctional. It's like a tourist spot called the Berkeley Pit, which you can go visit. But getting back to the point, Hughes is using these kind of like case studies of what happened when humanity like reached that or like reached farther and did more of the technology and what that meant for nature. So he kind of takes this idea that the mining civilizations in Pittsburgh and in Butte, Montana, they weren't all positive, even though you had like immense amounts of copper being produced from the mine and immense amount of like coal and iron being mined, and like feeding the developing economy. Like even though it's all good, you still have these negative effects. So with these negative effects, Hughes kind of ties all this up back into his conceptual claim about how we should rethink our use of technology through a religious approach, specifically dealing with, do we as creative and ostensibly divine human beings have the right to use technology to like achieve an Edenic state, or to reaffirm our stature before the divine fall. So that's the whole Judeo-Christian domination axiom that humanity did have that divine spark, that we were given dominion over nature, so we should exercise that. But what Hughes really emphasizes towards this last like section in this chapter is, did our pursuit of a second creation go awry? And he talks about, or he references specifically, these two, I guess, ecological case studies about what happened when we did use technology to that next level. It's kind of hard to really pick apart more pieces of his argument, because this is only one chapter in like a larger book. But I think that would be sufficient for what we need to cover for this class right now.